What's up, everybody, and welcome back to Mighty Ride Junkies. Today, we are looking at the history of Universal Studios Hollywood Studio Tour, the very heart and soul of this park. This is what started it all for the masses to frolic to the park in order to see the sets from some of their favorite movies and how exactly movie magic worked. So let's get started. The first studio tours ran in the mid-50s. Tourists would step on a Greyhound bus that would use the scenic route by taking you through the back lot of Universal Studios to see all the sets. This was short-lived and ended operation before the 50s were even over. In 1964, a second attempt was made for the studio tour, but this time Universal was using their very own trams, calling them the Glam Trams. And this was the only way someone could see the sets back then. It was immediately popular because it advertised a close-up look of the Bates Motel and Norman and his mother's house. The following year, the upper lot of the park opened, allowing guests more opportunities to experience the closest thing to being in a movie, and the third and final design of the studio tour, which you know today. While the tour time varies from decade to decade, it averages out at about 45 minutes, with the longest trips usually taking 2.5 hours, and the shortest being 35 minutes. It all depends really what's going on the set that day and what decade you did the tour. So I'm going to take you down this 4-acre tour with past and present attractions within the tour. I am not including set pieces or props because I don't want to ruin it for you too much if you've never been on the tour, which I highly recommend you do as your first ride of the day. I'm going to try my best to keep them in order of the actual tour, but keep in mind, sometimes the arrangement or the way they do things changes for whatever reason, whether it be permanent or temporary. In 1968, the tour began adding effects to its showcase to really thrust their guests into being on a movie set and seeing how it worked. In 1974, just as the tour began, guests would experience the rock slide, which is exactly as it sounds. The tram would stop at the end of a hill as the rocks would come tumbling down towards the tram. Now, the rocks were made of a styrofoam sponge material, and while it was more durable and weighed heavier than normal styrofoam, it absorbed water like a sponge. On rainy days, water would get soaked into the rocks, and when it hit the barrier between it and the guest, it would release all of its water content onto the guest, and the water didn't smell pleasant. On top of that, because of the material, the rocks would sometimes bounce high enough to hit the guest in the face. Eventually, it was decided it was best to take down the attraction in 1978. The following year, Battle of Galactica took its place, an attraction based on the show Battlestar Galactica, one of the first live-action shows to feature animatronics interacting with real actors. It received high praise from fans and guests alike until the mid-80s. At this point, the tour had added a handful of attractions and was being pressed for time. The script was changed for Battle of Galactica, leading it to cut almost a full 2 minutes from the script. Now it became a corny, mind-numbing mini stunt show. In 1992, it finally saw its last tour pass through as it was taken down to build Back to the Future: The Ride. Continuing down your tour, you'd run into the Burning House, a cult favorite for whatever reason. I mean, when it was first introduced in 1973, I could see the appeal of just seeing how live fire is used on sets. But when you compare it to the Backdraft experience, which one could argue was the replacement for the Burning House, one clearly delivers more eye candy than the next. The Burning House stayed burning until 1992 when it was taken down to make way for the very long-developed Jurassic Park ride. Moving on to the Collapsing Bridge, which entered the studio tour in 1974. Again, another bit that name literally means what it is. Basically, as the tram would approach a bridge, it would start to fall apart. You would think you'd be avoiding it, only to find out you were going to go over it. But of course, this is Hollywood, so the tram would make it across moments before the bridge would completely fall, sort of. This is a classic favorite among Universal Studio junkies, and it managed to keep falling and rebuilding itself up until 2006, when it was forced to close down due to safety issues. But after some high demand from park goers, Universal invested some money to try and repair the bridge and make it safe to fall apart again. In 2008, it reopened and continued operations until 2010, where it was used as a staging area for the new King Kong 360 3D experience. Which of course brings us to that attraction. I have a lot of sweet bitterness towards this ride. When it opened in 2010, I must have gone to the park at least once a month to try and experience it, but for some reason, the tram I rode skipped it because of time issues or it just wasn't working. Some 2 years later, I finally got to experience it, and it was well worth the wait. As a rider, you put on some handy-dandy, state-of-the-art plastic 3D glasses, and you find the tram in a thick jungle. Moments later, you find yourself caught between a fight between two dinos and King Kong himself. What's cool about this ride is that the screen is 360 degrees, so it gives you the illusion that you're covered from right to left. So you have a completely different view of the events of the ride depending on where you're sitting. So it has a massive re-ride value, although the title is a bit misleading. It really should be called King Kong 360 4D. 3D is a visual aspect, but 4D puts the audience in a more interactive spot. You feel the tram shake, sink, and move when it gets caught in the fight. And depending on where you're sitting, you can feel the blood, it's water of course, splashing on you. After you pass some set pieces from some of Universal's most famous films, you come across stage 55, where once inside, you get to experience cars dancing around fire. In 2006, Universal opened The Fast and the Furious Extreme Close-Up. Focusing mainly on the Tokyo Drift movie, guests would see how Hollywood could manipulate cars to do certain stunts. Awesome idea, horrible execution. This attraction is almost as frustrating as Elijah Wood wondering why you had to use hands to play a video game. And it didn't sit well with two bigwig producers that were responsible for forking out the dough to make the Fast and the Furious films. Aggressive negotiations were made to close this part of the tour. And while the entire negotiation was a mess, some of the highlights included the producers threatening to stop giving money for the production of the Fast and the Furious films. And since Universal had the rights to the franchise, the producers had the rights to Vin Diesel's contract. So no image, merchandise, or promotion could be made using Vin Diesel without the producer's approval. Since the studio had already learned the hard way once with not having Vin Diesel in one of the Fast and the Furious movies, Universal caved, and in 2013, Stage 55 was shut down along with the Extreme Close-Up. And I don't think anyone will miss it. Right down the hill, you would enter which could arguably be the most classic attraction on this tour, the Flash Flood, which opened in 1968. It's a very simple design, but simple enough to stand the test of time. The tram would stop in front of an old town before you could see how rain is made for film, and then experience a flash flood. This set has also been featured in a handful of films. In 1974, if you crossed into the Old West, you would have to look out for the runaway train. From 1974 to 1985, guests would stop along a railroad track to witness a speeding locomotive coming straight at them, and of course, only stopping just in time before hitting the tram. Starting in 1986, the tram would take its riders into a city being terrorized by a massive beast. You would see destroyed buildings, helicopters, and even the bridge the tram would try and get across would shake as you would get a close-up encounter with the one and only King Kong. This attraction used to scare the crap out of me when I was a kid, and even as a teenager when the fear subsided, I couldn't help but appreciate the detail within the attraction. In 2008, Universal Studios was cursed with another fire that destroyed the entire set of the King Kong encounter. Plans began to remake the ride, but to reflect Peter Jackson's adaptation from his 2005 film, which ended up being King Kong 360 3D experience. Moving on to the Park Lake, we have the Torpedo Attack Submarine. This attraction would show guests a submerged submarine moments before firing a torpedo at them. Of course, the driver of the tram would manage to get away before the torpedo could hit. The closing of this attraction is really surrounded in mystery. After its initial add-on to the tour in 1971, the attraction just stopped sometime in 1984. However, there have been records of the attraction having surprise appearances in 85 and 86. This leads me to believe the attraction was pulled for technical difficulties, but we'll never know for certain. On to the Red Sea attraction, which opened in 1973. The train would stop in front of the lake to demonstrate how to split the seas like Moses in the Ten Commandments. Once the sea was split, the train would go through the water where the rider's eyes would end up at water level. But there is some idiocy to this design. Because of the narrow track versus the long tram, if the water didn't drain while it was attempting to part, the tram had no choice but to go through the water. Don't believe me?
Take a look at your screens. I'll play a few bloopers for you as we travel into the sea.
The Red Sea sits on the park lake that was used in one of my absolute favorite monster movies, Creature of the Black Lagoon. You can actually see the creature pop out of the water from time to time until the theme of the Red Sea was changed. In 2006, it was changed to another King Kong attraction where you could see how they filmed using miniature models. In 2016, the lake, the mini boats, and the creature were removed to begin constructing new sound studios and storage units. Just beyond the Red Sea, you would see a frightening sight as you pass through a hut village, an angry gorilla holding a human arm. In late 1971, this attraction was added. The human arm was a bit much for people, and it was removed from the ape's clutches sometime later. However, the effect clearly didn't have what the studio wanted anymore, and the attraction was removed altogether in 1973. On to Earthquake, which began shaking people in 1988. Here, the tram would enter a subway station when an earthquake would happen. You'd end up being thrown into a flash flood, dodging the road collapsing onto you, and barely miss getting sideswiped by an oncoming train. It's a lot of fun. Once you had your brain rock back and forth, you'd cool off at the docks of Amity Island. Since 1976, 1 year after the Best Picture nominee was released, this shark has been terrifying tram riders. Now on to the big finale of the tour, Doomed Glacier Expedition. From 1975 to 1997, the tram would take you to a snow summit only for an avalanche to happen. The walls around you would spin and you would feel like you were rolling around in the falling snow. In 1997, the attraction went through a complete 180 as it now focused on fire and lava of a volcano. It still had the same design but now focused from its inspiration from the Dante's Peak film. In 2000, the attraction closed for another redesign. In preparation for its 2001 release, The Mummy Returns, the spinning tunnel reopened as the Curse of the Mummy's Tomb that same year. In this version, you would go into Imhotep's tomb only to awake him as he angrily sends you deeper into the tomb, and the walls around you would spin and feel like you were rolling in a sandstorm. Basically, all they did was put a new skin on the ride and call it something else. But it remained in this spot until 2013 when the revolving tunnel was finally torn down. In 2015, Fast and the Furious Supercharged was placed in that location. With all the negative feedback and backlash that came from Fast and the Furious Extreme Close-Up, Universal Studios definitely wanted to redeem themselves. Enter Supercharged. The ride uses the same setup as King Kong's 360 3D. You basically find yourself on a car chase between the Fast and the Furious family, minus Brian O'Connor, as they go against villain Owen Shaw. Like King Kong, it's a lot of fun and holds a high re-ride value because of the different things you can see every time you ride. And in typical Fast and the Furious fashion, you will see and be a part of some pretty unreal stunts. And that is the history and layout of Universal Studios Hollywood Studio Tour. As you can tell from this, I'm doing the timeline of attractions a little different compared to my videos of Six Flags Magic Mountain, because it was just getting confusing, and going in this order may work better. I don't know. We'll find out. Anyways, hope you enjoyed, and let me know by hitting that like button or leaving a comment down below. If you're new here and want to hear more, please subscribe, and take care. See you soon.